the ancient Indian texts talk a lot about Vimanas. Vimana is a flying machine.
The Sanskrit texts of the Hindu and Buddhist tradition talk about incredible flying craft called Vimanas.
Elon Musk's Grok AI recently gained access to some of the oldest writings ever created by humanity, ancient Sanskrit manuscripts, some more than 3,000 years old, texts that explain, in technical detail, flying machines able to travel across continents, hover quietly, become invisible, and even move beyond Earth's atmosphere. For centuries, scholars dismissed these descriptions as mythology, poetic symbolism, and religious stories about gods who could fly. Grok AI did not reject them. It examined the technical language in these texts the same way it would study any engineering document. And what it discovered in the precise vocabulary, the dimensional descriptions, and the operating instructions hidden inside these ancient manuscripts is making researchers ask a question they find deeply unsettling. What if the ancient Indians were describing something real? In today's video, we will explore exactly what Grok AI discovered in these Sanskrit texts, the specific machines they describe, the technical details that seem completely out of place in 3,000-year-old religious poetry, and the one researcher who devoted his entire career to showing the world what these texts truly contained. Stay until the end because the conclusion is supported by stronger evidence than anything you have heard about ancient flying machines before. The earliest references appear in the Rigveda, one of the world's oldest religious texts, composed around 1500 to 1200 BCE.
Information gleaned from ancient Indian texts that are believed to have been formally set to writing in 500 BC.
The Rigveda includes descriptions of vehicles called Vimanas, used by the gods to travel across the sky. These descriptions are poetic and often symbolic, and mainstream scholars have consistently interpreted them as mythological accounts of divine beings naturally traveling through the heavens, using flight as a metaphor for divine power and movement. This explanation fits the Rigveda's most poetic passages, but the Sanskrit literature about Vimanas does not end there. The Ramayana, one of the two great Sanskrit epics, describes the Pushpaka Vimana in far more detailed terms.
Vimana. This is Ravana's Pushpaka. This was a golden palace-sized aircraft. They are described as these extraordinary flying palaces or chariots with these magical features.
This is the flying vehicle used by the villain Ravana and later by the hero Rama. The Pushpaka is described as able to carry many people, move freely in any direction, propel itself without animal or human power, and adjust its speed and altitude. Its interior is described with detailed architectural features, rooms, seating arrangements, and gardens. The Mahabharata, the other great Sanskrit epic, contains several references to flying vehicles used during battle. Vimanas that carry weapons, move at great speed, and fight in aerial combat. Some passages describe attacks from flying craft that sound surprisingly similar to aerial bombardment. But the text that Grok AI examined most closely is not any of these famous epics. It is a much less familiar Sanskrit manuscript known as the Vaimanika Shastra. The Vaimanika Shastra and what it truly says. The Vaimanika Shastra is a Sanskrit text reportedly transcribed in the early 20th century by an Indian scholar named Pandit Subbaraya Shastri, who claimed he received it through psychic channeling from an ancient sage. The manuscript, written between 1904 and 1923, explains in technical detail the construction, operation, and navigation of Vimanas. This origin story is exactly what leads mainstream scholars to dismiss the text completely. A manuscript produced through claimed psychic revelation in the early 1900s is not archaeological evidence of ancient technology. But here is what makes the Vaimanika Shastra genuinely fascinating to serious researchers. The technical content it presents shows no connection to any aircraft technology that existed or was being developed while Shastri was writing. The text explains concepts, specific propulsion principles, materials with unusual properties, and navigation using the sun and stars that Shastri, a Sanskrit scholar without an engineering background, had no obvious way to invent from contemporary sources. In 1974, a team of aeronautical engineers and scientists at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore carried out a formal technical analysis of the Vaimanika Shastra's aircraft designs. They concluded that the designs, as described, could not fly using conventional aerodynamic principles. The report is often presented as definitive debunking, but researchers who studied the complete report noticed something the brief dismissal leaves out. The analysis found the designs aerodynamically impossible, yet it also noted that the specific materials the text recommends for construction possessed properties the engineers could not identify or match with any known substance. Unknown materials described in technical detail within a manuscript whose author claimed they were not his own invention. Grok AI's analysis of the Vaimanika Shastra focused specifically on this material's question, comparing the Sanskrit names and property descriptions of the 17 unique materials the text mentions against every known material and material combination in modern materials science databases. None of them matched anything already in the database. Subscribe right now because what Grok AI discovered when it compared the Vaimanika Shastra's operational descriptions with the physics of unconventional propulsion systems is where this becomes genuinely hard to explain away. The man who dedicated his life to this. Before exploring what Grok AI discovered, it is important to understand the one mainstream scholar who spent decades insisting that the Vimana texts deserved serious attention. Dr. V. Ragavan was a Sanskrit scholar at the University of Madras, not a fringe researcher, not a pseudoscientist, but a fully qualified academic who received India's highest civilian honor, the Padma Bhushan, for his contributions to Sanskrit scholarship. In 1974, during the Indian National Science Academy Symposium on Ancient Indian Science, Dr. Ragavan presented a paper arguing that the descriptions of Vimanas in ancient Sanskrit texts were far too specific and technically detailed to be dismissed as mere mythology. He argued that some form of advanced aerial technology may have existed in ancient India and that the text preserved genuine knowledge passed down through generations, gradually becoming woven into religious and mythological storytelling over time. His presentation sparked controversy. Mainstream archaeologists and historians highlighted the complete absence of physical evidence. No wreckage, no manufacturing sites, and no contemporary historical records from other civilizations describing Indian flying machines. Dr. Ragavan's response to this criticism was clear. He pointed out that the materials the Vimana texts describe for construction include substances that would not survive in the archaeological record the way metal or stone would. If those materials were organic composites or substances that naturally decompose over time, physical evidence would not be expected to survive for thousands of years. The absence of physical evidence, he argued, was not the same as evidence of absence. He passed away in 1979 without reaching any scholarly consensus regarding his position. His work was largely overlooked by mainstream Sanskrit scholarship after his death. Grok AI rediscovered his analysis during its broader review of the scholarly literature surrounding Vimana texts and highlighted his specific arguments about materials as deserving the kind of computational cross-referencing that simply was not available to him in 1974. What Grok discovered in the technical language. When Grok AI analyzed the technical passages of the Vaimanika Shastra and the more detailed Vimana descriptions found in the Mahabharata, it applied the same method it uses for any technical document, treating the language as descriptive instead of symbolic while extracting the operational and engineering details hidden throughout the text. Several findings immediately stood out. First, the propulsion descriptions. The Vaimanika Shastra describes a propulsion system that does not involve combustion, does not rely on any burning fuel, and functions through the interaction of specific atmospheric layers with particular materials within the craft's structure. This description does not match any propulsion technology that existed when the text was written or, for that matter, any propulsion technology operating today. It does, however, show structural similarities to theoretical principles behind several unconventional propulsion concepts that physicists have explored in recent decades, including electrohydrodynamic propulsion and certain theoretical interpretations of zero-point energy interaction. The AI carefully noted that structural similarity between an ancient text and a modern theoretical concept is not evidence that the ancient text accurately describes that concept. It could simply be coincidence. It could also result from language broad enough that many different ideas appear to fit. What the AI identified as genuinely fascinating is the precision of the Sanskrit terminology. The text uses separate technical terms for components, materials, and operational modes that strongly suggest the author was describing specific, distinct elements rather than broad poetic references to flight. Second, the navigation descriptions. The Vimana text explains navigation using what roughly translates as sensitivity to specific cosmic energies or atmospheric electrical conditions. Grok AI identified this description as potentially consistent with navigation using the Earth's magnetic field, a concept completely unknown in ancient India according to standard historical accounts, yet described with enough precision that the AI considered it worthy of closer attention. Third, the operational limitations. This is the finding researchers considered most fascinating. Unlike most ancient descriptions of divine vehicles which can travel anywhere and accomplish anything without restriction, the Vaimanika Shastra describes operational limits, conditions where the craft cannot function, altitude restrictions, and seasonal changes in performance. These limitations are exactly what you would expect to find in an engineering document describing a real machine with practical constraints, and exactly what you would not expect from a religious text describing a god's magical flying throne. The question archaeology cannot answer. The standard objection to every ancient advanced technology theory is straightforward. Where is the physical evidence? Where are the engines, the manufacturing tools, and the metal components that should survive thousands of years within the archaeological record? This objection is compelling for most claims involving ancient technology. For the Vimana question specifically, Grok AI's analysis identified one reason why it may be less conclusive than it appears. The materials the Vaimanika Shastra specifies for Vimana construction are almost entirely organic or composite. Plant-based resins, specific minerals combined in unusual ways, and materials described as lightweight and responsive to atmospheric conditions. With only one or two exceptions, none of the listed construction materials would survive in the archaeological record for thousands of years under normal preservation conditions. This does not prove Vimanas were real. It simply means the absence of physical evidence is exactly what you would expect, whether the text describes genuine technology or imagined mythology, making the archaeological silence genuinely uncertain rather than definitively negative. What Grok AI concluded, carefully and with a clear acknowledgement of uncertainty, is that the Vimana texts contain an unusually high level of internally consistent technical detail involving materials, operational parameters, and navigation systems for writings that mainstream scholarship classifies as purely religious mythology. This internal consistency does not prove the texts describe real technology, but it reveals a pattern that the AI's analysis could not completely explain through conventional interpretations. The question nobody wants to ask. This is where the story leads and why Grok AI's analysis matters beyond the specific question of whether ancient Indian flying machines actually existed. If even a small portion of what the Vimana texts describe reflects genuine technological knowledge that once existed in ancient India, it raises difficult questions about where that knowledge originated and why it vanished so completely that no physical evidence, no continuation into later Indian technology, and no parallel development in other contemporary civilizations provides any trace of it. Ancient Indian civilization was remarkably advanced. The mathematical achievements preserved in Sanskrit texts include concepts such as the value of pi, early algebra, and astronomical calculations with extraordinary accuracy. The philosophical and grammatical sophistication of Sanskrit literature is beyond dispute. It is not impossible, at least in principle, that this civilization developed technological knowledge in certain fields that fail to survive within the physical archaeological record. What Grok AI cannot determine And what no AI analysis of ancient texts can determine is whether the technical precision it identified in the Vimana manuscripts represents genuine ancient knowledge, remarkable ancient imagination, or something between the two. The text contains something that resembles engineering thinking. Whether that engineering thinking describes actual machines or carefully imagined fictional ones is a question the texts themselves cannot answer. Subscribe because the ongoing digitization of Sanskrit manuscript collections across India continues making previously inaccessible texts available for the same kind of computational analysis Grok AI applied here. Some of the most technically detailed Vimana texts still remain in manuscript form inside Indian university libraries, studied by Sanskrit scholars but never examined through the type of cross-disciplinary technical analysis represented by this research. When those texts become available for comprehensive AI analysis, the picture of what ancient Indian knowledge truly contained and whether any of it describes things that should never have existed will become much clearer. We will be here when that happens. The Mercury Vortex Engine. Among the detailed technical descriptions found in the Vaimanika Shastra, one has attracted more attention from engineers and physicists who have studied it than any other. The description of what the text calls the Mercury Vortex Engine. The Vaimanika Shastra describes a propulsion mechanism involving heated mercury spinning in a precise circular pattern inside a container, generating a force the text claims creates upward thrust. The description includes detailed operational instructions covering the direction of rotation, the required temperature, and the geometric design of the container. The reason this description receives serious attention is because it does not describe anything mythological. Gods do not require Mercury vortex engines. Divine beings in religious texts fly simply because they are divine. They do not depend on technical propulsion systems described with this level of operational detail. The precision of the Mercury vortex description is exactly the kind of information expected in an engineering manual, not inside a religious story about supernatural beings. When Grok AI analyzed this specific passage using modern physics, it identified something genuinely worth noticing. Spinning mercury under certain conditions does create measurable electromagnetic effects. This is well documented in modern physics experiments and is not considered controversial. What the text claims, that this spinning mercury creates enough upward thrust to lift a vehicle, has never been demonstrated and may conflict with established physics. But identifying spinning mercury as something unique, something possessing unusual electromagnetic properties valuable for a propulsion system, represents a genuine observation about material behavior that is neither obvious nor well understood during early 20th century science. The question is not whether a Mercury vortex engine could actually fly. The question is how an ancient text came to identify Mercury's electromagnetic behavior as the foundation for a propulsion concept. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. The descriptions that go beyond Earth. Perhaps the most remarkable passages in the Mahabharata's Vimana descriptions are those that describe journeys beyond Earth's atmosphere. The epic includes passages describing Vimanas traveling to other worlds, not as symbolic journeys into divine realms, but through descriptions mentioning the absence of air, changing conditions at extreme altitudes, and the appearance of Earth when viewed from vast distances. Mainstream Sanskrit scholars interpret these passages as accounts of divine celestial travel, mythological journeys between cosmological realms without any physical meaning. This interpretation is reasonable for much of the text's cosmological content, but Grok AI highlights specific passages where the language shifts from clearly mythological to unexpectedly observational. Descriptions explaining how the sky changes color with increasing altitude, references to the difficulty of breathing at great heights, and one passage describing Earth as appearing round and clearly bounded when seen from far above. The Earth appears round when viewed from above. That is a scientifically correct observation. The concept of a spherical Earth was known to certain ancient Greek philosophers, but this understanding was neither widespread nor reflected in Indian astronomical texts from the same period with the level of detail found in Greek sources. So how does a mythological account of divine celestial travel contain the specific and accurate observation that Earth appears round and bounded when viewed from a great enough distance? Grok AI identified this passage as the single most unusual finding in its entire analysis of the Vimana texts, an accurate observational detail embedded within a mythological narrative that seemingly should not exist if the story were entirely fictional. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nature Mystery Unravel Mysteries. Learn untold tales of history and stay in the exciting world of new discoveries.